Do you ever get confused between those two words, scaling a company and growing a company? Like, what is the difference? If you're somewhat confused, that's totally understandable because so many people use the words interchangeably. Like, the definition of growing and scaling are exactly the same, and they're not. Definitions actually matter. Even though podcasters or authors or writers in magazines may use them interchangeably, they are not the same thing because definitions do matter, as does the context of the word grow or the context of the word scale. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to help you understand the difference between growing and scaling. They're similar, kind of like an old Venn diagram where you have the two circles. There's a center section that's the same, but they're parts that are completely different. And once you understand those, it will help you make better decisions about how you can actually grow or scale your company. And I think you're going to enjoy this. So let's start off with the idea of growth. And what do we mean in a business context? Remember, context reigns as king. A business context when we talk about growth. In virtually every instance, we're talking about top line revenue growth. So when somebody says, I grew my company this year, let's say they had $1 million company last year and now it's 1.5 million this year, they're saying, hey, I grew my company by 50%. So I went from 1 million to 1.5 million. That's growth. It's almost always top line growth whenever you hear someone talk about growing your company. Now, what you don't hear when you hear somebody say, I grew my company, is you don't hear them say, well, here's what my profitability looked like. Okay? Because frequently companies will grow fast and their profitability goes out the door. And in fact, a lot of companies will actually grow so fast that they kill themselves because they weren't paying attention to profitability. That's why there's that old phrase, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king. Because while profit is good, you can't pay bills with profit. You can only pay them with cash. So cash is even more important than profit. But when someone's talking about growing their company, they're almost always thinking about how do I grow my top line revenue number? Because that's the number people brag about. Oh, my company used to be doing 5 million, now we're doing 10 million or 15 million or 20 million or whatever the number would be, because they think that a lot of people are impressed by that. But when you're growing your company, one of the inherent problems of growing a company, not scaling a company, is that there tends to be a linear or collinear relationship between your expense base and your revenue. So as your revenues go up, your expenses go up in general linearly, if not negatively, in the sense that it now costs you more to produce each dollar of revenue, right? Because you're adding more resources, adding more people. And in many cases, it tends to just follow a straight path. So let's just say each recruiter, if you had a recruiting company, can generate around $250,000 of revenue. So if we want to generate an extra million, we need to hire 4 recruiters. And then not only do we pay them, but we pay their expenses. And then it takes them some time to ramp up before they're actually profitable. And so your expense base increases while your profitability goes down. So what tends to happen when people are focusing on growth and not paying attention to profit, they often will end up growing themselves to a place of difficulty, if not death. In fact, I have a friend who grew a $70 million company, wasn't paying attention to profitability, and the company was gone. This happens all the time. So when someone's talking about growth, they're almost always talking about revenue, though they could be talking about growing a number of locations or growing number of people on their staff, et cetera. But almost always they're talking about revenue growth. And there tends to be a linear relationship so that it costs you $150,000 for each person that you're adding to the staff. Whatever that linear relationship is, that's how it works. Now, what's important to note here is that growth doesn't necessarily mean slow growth. Like if you went from 1 million to 2 million, you could grow there, not scale there, and that would be 100% growth in a year. So growth isn't necessarily related to small, 5 or 10%, and scaling is equal to 25 or 50%. The reality is that you can grow very rapidly, but there's still this relationship with your expense base, and that is what causes somebody to be in growth mode as opposed to scale mode. So hopefully you understand what it means to grow your business. You're growing your top line revenue growth, but it really doesn't have any relationship to your profitability or your efficiency or anything else. So that's number one. That's what it means to grow a company. What does it mean to scale a company? Well, scaling comes out of the engineering world. And in the engineering world, when you're talking about scaling, let's say a building, you're talking about increasing amount of weight, and the building needs to handle that weight. So you had a 2-story office building. Now I want to turn it into a 10-story. So I'm going to have a lot of extra weight. How do I scale this building up from 2 to 10 without it falling apart? Or we had a bridge that was this long and now we want a bridge that's going to be this long. How do we somehow span that gap and the bridge doesn't collapse? So scaling really comes out of the engineering world. So when you're thinking about scaling a company, the first thing that you want to think about is, how do we grow this thing sustainably? In other words, how can we grow it without it tumbling, which means that profitability does in fact matter. The second part of that is that scaling in a business context, as opposed to necessarily an engineering context, is you're really focused in on efficiency. That the cost that cost for your revenue dollars is actually going down, so your profitability is going up. This is one of the reasons why SaaS companies tend to scale quickly, because they might have a big upfront load in terms of developing the software, but as they add more customers, the cost of the development keeps going down. Every time they add one on, it becomes less and less expensive. So therefore, their profitability goes up over time versus, let's say, a typical law firm or accounting firm, and you keep adding one body who can handle X number of customers or clients, then you have to keep adding those number of bodies. In software, you don't have to keep adding as many bodies because you can keep adding customers without adding as much on the expense base. So that's one of the key differences when you're thinking about scaling a business. You're thinking about, how can I do this in a sustainable way and in a more efficient way so that I have profitability? In addition, if you want to be able to scale quickly, you have to be more anticipatory. So if you know that there's a relationship between the number of people you have who can handle X number of customers, in a scaling company, because you want to be able to handle that increased stress, you would say, hey, I know that in 3 months we're going to have a need, so therefore I'm going to hire somebody now because it'll take them 3 months to get up to speed so that when the need is, they'll be there. In growth mode, people usually aren't as anticipatory. They tend to be more reactive, and so they're simply waiting until the need arises and they go, oh man, we're overwhelmed now. What are we going to do? We need to hire somebody. And then by the time they hire them and the time they get them up to speed, it might be 6 or 9 months later. And so they tend to be behind the curve. In a scalable company, you're anticipating what the needs are going to be. That's one of the reasons why profitability and cash become so important in a scalable company, because you're trying to anticipate what the needs are going to be, and you need to be able to sustain whatever that amount of growth is. So if you wanted to kind of a short definition of scalability, it would be sustainable, efficient growth. Right? So remember, you can have growth without being sustainable, and you can have growth without being efficient, but you cannot have scale without those two things. But you can still have growth. So the growth part is the part that's similar in terms of revenue growth, but this one cares a lot about profitability and sustainability and structures and systems. So that's the difference between the two. Growth is primarily focused in on top-line revenue growth, and scalability is focused in on sustainable, efficient revenue growth, where profitability matters and you're trying to reduce the cost that it has per customer so that you increase your profitability. Even better, if you can increase the revenue per employee while decreasing the cost per customer, then you got lots of profit, which is good for everybody. All right, so that's the difference between the two. Now, how do we make this practical? Well, in the BizScalers world, the definition that I use for creating a scalable company is this. A scalable company is a systematized business that is designed and built to grow fast, can handle that growth profitably, and can deliver a consistent and predictable result to its customers. So if you want to have some practical guidelines here, I would use those 4 things to help you think about building a more scalable version of your business. 1, is it systematized, or what's the next system we need to build? Anything that isn't systematized can't scale, right? It's going to break down if it's not systematized. So look at what are the core things that you need to systematize, and look at what are the things you need to get off your plate, and work on those 2 things first and then systematize them. Because the more systematized your business is, and it's not dependent on a specific person doing that task, the easier it is going to be to scale, right? Because you can continue to grow and sustain that growth. So number 1, it's systematized. So work on your systems. Number 2, it's designed and built to grow fast. So that means that you need to pick some number, probably north of 5 or 10 or 15% growth if you want to scale your company. At 26% growth, you double your business every 3 years. At 42, you double it every 2 years. And at 100, you double it every year. So probably I would suggest you pick a number somewhere north of 25. Like somewhere in that would probably be where you'd want to grow if you want to scale your company. Nothing wrong, by the way, to grow your company at 10 or 15%. But if you want to scale, you're probably going to go at a little bit faster clip, somewhere probably north of 25%. So it's designed and built to grow fast. So that means you also have to build the infrastructure. It has to be able to sustain that growth. So you'd look and say, hey, do we have enough people? Are we anticipating where growth is going to be? How long does it take us to ramp up new employees? Do we have the cash to be able to handle that? What are we doing to decrease our expense base per customer or per revenue dollar? And how can we increase our profitability? Those are all sustainable things. What are we doing to have enough cash? That's the third part of the puzzle. And then the fourth part is to make sure you're delivering a consistent and predictable result to your customers. So I would just look back and say, okay, when I'm looking at our customers and I'm looking at the people delivering the service or delivering the product, are they getting a consistent, dependable result from this? And if the answer is yes from Frank, but not from Sally, then I know I got a problem. Or if I look and I say, hey, this is a good result, but it's not remarkable, well, then I need to figure out how do we make this a better result and a better experience for our customers, because then they're probably going to buy more frequently from us and they're going to refer more people from us. And when people refer, you don't have a cost of acquisition for that. And that means that your profitability by definition is going to go up. So any way you look at it, I think that's a pretty good way for you to think about growing and scaling your business. Can we systematize this business? Can we design it and build it to grow fast? Can we do it in a way that we can sustain that growth profitably? And can we deliver a consistent, predictable result to our customers? If you do those four things, you'll probably be able to move out of just the growth mode and move into the scale mode. And I think that's why you're listening to this in the first place. So I hope that helps you understand the difference between growing and scaling a business. If this was helpful for you, make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, whether you're watching this on video on YouTube or listen to it on your favorite podcast channel. And if you know some other business owners and entrepreneurs whom this might be valuable, make sure you pass this along to them. I would highly appreciate you doing that. And make sure you check in next week for our next episode of Growth School. I hope you enjoyed this week. Until to your accelerated success, Bruce out.